Good morning, and welcome to the National Press Club, where news happens. You may be alarmed to learn that I am not Emily Wilkins. I'm Herb Jackson. I am the politics editor at CQ and Roll Call, and I am a vice chair of the Board of Governors here at the Press Club. Thank you for joining us for our Headliners Newsmaker in person, online. We'll be hearing from Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and our panelists from UNESCO and the World Bank. We're happy to accept your questions online. As time permits, we'll get to them. Just email headliners@press.org and use press freedom in the subject line. Today we'll be discussing the findings of a new study on the relationship between press freedom and advancing democratic values and economic development. As journalists, we're well aware of the attacks on press freedom around the globe, the threats, the crackdowns, the detentions, the doxing, the disinformation campaigns that make it harder for us to bring accurate, truthful information to populations we serve. The 2023 World Press Freedom Index found that the environment for journalism was bad in 70% of the 180 countries it examined. Authoritarian governments, intent on maintaining a stranglehold on information, often reach beyond their borders to intimidate and even attack journalists that threaten their regimes, according to a Freedom House recent report. That report documented 112 acts against journalists working in exile over the last decade. All of this is compounded by the collapse of the economic models that sustain journalism for decades. What that toll does to the battle to control and manipulate information, to throttle journalists and journalism, and the impact it's having on a wider world, on democracy, civic engagement, and economic prosperity, that's what we're going to talk about, some of it today. Today we'll hear from Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, a professor at Columbia University and the former chief economist at the World Bank, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2001 for his work on information asymmetry. That's how a situation in which one party has more or better information than the other party can affect different markets, such as insurance or mortgages. Recently, Dr. Stiglitz has spoken out on the need to create policies to mitigate the societal harms caused by the rise of big tech. Let me also take a moment, Dr. Stiglitz, to congratulate you on your forthcoming book, The Road to Freedom, Economics in a Good Society. Today, Dr. Stiglitz will share with us the findings of a UNESCO study on journalism for development that he co-authored with Anya and Dylan Groves. Following his remarks, Dr. Stiglitz will be joined in conversation with Dr. Arturo Gutierrez, an economist and global director for governance at the World Bank. We'll also hear from Christian Burgess, a senior program specialist at UNESCO in Paris who leads the work on outreach and advocacy for freedom of expression and the safety of journalism. Gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club, and Dr. Stiglitz, the floor is yours.
You want me to talk from there?
Sure.
Okay.
If you're comfortable.
Well, is this okay? Can everybody? Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I really welcome this opportunity to address you about our new report, Journalism for Development, which I hope all of you will read. I'm going to begin my remarks by a little bit explaining why an economist gets interested in the subject, besides the fact that my wife is a journalist and teaches journalism at Columbia. And I want to say Dylan is here, and I'm going to have to leave right after for another meeting, but Dylan can be around and answer any questions that you might have. As we just pointed out, my own research began talking about the role of information. And it was about how important it was to have good information for a well-functioning economy. Oh, I think. Is it working? No. Is this working better? Yeah. Okay. So good information is important for a well-functioning economy, but it's also important for a well-functioning society. And economists talk about the role of prices as the mechanism by which information gets transmitted in the economy. Part of my research was to show that prices were an important part, but didn't really convey all the relevant information. But when we come to the broader reach of society, we know that there's a lot more richer information space than can be conveyed by prices. And this is where journalism comes in and plays a very important role. It plays an important role in, for instance, conveying information about what people care about, and we've been, read about all the time, to policymakers, and it conveys information to everybody about how well the governments are doing, corporations are doing, and if we are going to hold accountable our leaders, whether they're corporate leaders or our public officials, government leaders, we have to know what they're doing. And the mechanism by which information is transmitted is journalism, a free, independent press, the fourth estate. And so in a sense, anybody concerned with the well-functioning of our society has to be concerned about the scope for journalism, the press, to do its job. Now, one of the important aspects of, again, an economic idea of information is that it's a public good. We all benefit from there being good information about how well our public officials are doing, whether they're corrupt or not, or how badly they're doing. Our corporate leaders, I mean, let me make it clear, it's both public and private. So as a public good, one of the basic ideas in economics, modern economics, is that the market will undersupply public goods because everybody benefits. And therefore, the incentive of any individual to make those expenditures for the provision of the public good will be too low. And the implication of that is that in one way or another, there will have to be public support. And I'll come back to that later on. But the notion of information being something which everybody in society benefits, and that therefore it can't just be one can't just rely on the market is critical. Now, for the last maybe 100 years, we've had a peculiar but workable way of providing, supporting the press, journalism, which is through advertising and subscription. And it was not perfect. It was you might say, a coincidence but an understandable one that there was you might say, a joint production of information that was valuable, but that meant people would want to buy a newspaper, but that meant that it was a good place to do advertising. And the value that you brought together of having news and advertising information meant people were willing to pay subscriptions. Now that business model was, you might say, an accident because it was not a perfect solution to the public good problem. And many countries recognized that it was not a perfect solution and provided for public support of radio, TV, when those new media came in, and in a few countries, even for a diverse media, because they recognized that the way it was done in the private sector may not lead to as much diversity as one would have wanted. And there were other mechanisms for support, public support through advertising and so forth. But it was sort of a patchwork. That particular solution, an accidental solution, you might say, has broken down in the last 10 years. It's been a dramatic decrease, which our society hasn't really fully grasped. And what's broken it down is social media. Social media becomes people believe, a better way of getting advertising messages out there, because it can be targeted. It uses algorithms. It's a surveillance economy, so it knows more about you than you know about yourself, and then it figures out what it is that you will read and maybe prompt you to do things maybe that you don't want to do, but it makes money for other people. And so that particular business model that has worked for 100 years has really, in the last 5 to 10 years, broken down totally. And it means that not only advertising, but the subscription has broken down. And so we are really at a moment where we really face a big challenge. What this report is motivated behind it is how do we respond to that challenge? But before we got there, we wanted to document how important it was to have a free and diverse press. And this is another area in which there's been a lot of progress, in research in the last 10, 15 years. We've gotten data. People always, especially journalists, of course, believed that they were having good impacts on society. But now we can document that. And not only can we document it in the sense that there are correlations, places where there are better, more news media perform in one way or another better. People like Amartya Sen argue that in places where you have a good media, you don't have the kinds of famine that you had in China. So there are long been studies, you might say, of correlations. But now we have really, using the best statistical techniques, ways of showing causation. It's sort of almost like a controlled experiment. And really very interesting from a methodological point of view, studies, where you have a rollout of some form of media affected by access to a new technology, or that the media becomes available in one place or another before than it was. And then you can document the impact on the availability of a diverse media. And so you really have almost a controlled experiment. And those have confirmed that media really does have big impacts. It has impacts on, the quality of government, on corruption, on voter turnout, on the private sector, on corporate accountability. So I think that we now have, and the report documents, I won't summarize them all, but documents the multiple well-identified statistical results showing how the media really does have the effects that many of us, all of us, I think, believed were there. And, it's sort of, sometimes as an economist, you wonder, what are we really doing? We're showing what everybody knows, but sometimes what everybody knows is not true. And in this case, it turned out what everybody knows was true. So that should make us feel better, but it also should make us really worried, because if that is true, and if the business model has really deteriorated in the way the evidence is overwhelming, we now have a very big policy challenge. And so the last few minutes, I want to talk about the set of recommendations that we have at the end of our report after documenting the impacts. And I should have begun by pointing out that this is a UNESCO report. I guess you'll talk about. UNESCO has long been engaged in advocacy and enhancing our understanding of the role of the free press. And the UN has adopted some principles. Maybe you'll talk about the Windhoek principles of free media. So we want to thank the UNESCO for the support of our project. The first, we divided our recommendations into 3 pillars. The first pillar is creating an enabling environment for professional journalism. And there are 2 parts of that. Some of this is what all of us begin with, the First Amendment, this room. You know, the right to tell, the right of a free press. But we also say part of the enabling environment is the right to know. That if you're going to tell, you have to have access to information, and particularly in the context of the government is supposed to be working for us, and therefore we should have the right to know. I mean, in the press is a critical, what is going on. That's embedded in our Freedom of Information Act. But in the United States, we were very late in getting those Freedom of Information Act. Sweden had it for 200 years, and enforcement of those laws in many places is not adequate. And you need it not only at the federal level, but every part of our government. And so, I mean, and a lot of countries don't have adequate Freedom of Information Act. So it's the right to tell, right to know. But it's also, you might say, the right not to be intimidated. And that has become a real problem. Killing of journalists. Some countries have become notorious for the killing of journalists. We don't want to talk about, what is going on right now in terms of the deaths of journalists. It's really appalling. And there, you know, but also some of the software, like Pegasus, is able to break through who the sources are and engage in intimidation. So new technology has really changed the potential for this freedom from intimidation. So the creating an enabling environment is really partly because of the new challenges, new technologies become a much more difficult and much, it's really the number one. But the second one is public support for the media. I began my remarks by saying information is a public good, and therefore whatever our system is, we are going to have to think carefully about the role of public media. Now, there is a view in some quarters that you shouldn't have government providing information. Some countries have succeeded in creating independent ways of doing that are not contaminated, and a independent, publicly supported free press actually enhances trust in other forms, private press, and in society more general. So countries that have succeeded in getting a good, independent, publicly supported media actually create a better environment for all the media and for our society more generally. So public broadcasting is an important part of this public support, but it's not the only part. some countries have recognized that in many places there is only one press, and that's become increasingly a problem. You have monopoly press, and you have to counter that. And they have done that by having public support for a second or third vehicle, media. So we want media diversity, and there are other ways of providing public support that we talk about in our paper. The third is ensuring a diverse, viable private media and avoiding capture. And we all know what some parts of that mean, avoiding capture. The press has an important role in setting the agenda, framing how we see the world. But unfortunately, in some countries, that press is captured by a few or one wealthy person. The United States is not the only one where one wealthy person controls a form of media that reaches out to maybe a third of the population. Italy has had even more of a problem, where when Berlusconi was controlled both the public press, and they did not have a strong institutional safeguards, and the private press. So 6 of the 7 television stations were controlled. That's not a diverse media. So you really need institutions to prevent capture, and capture can occur in many ways. Here our antitrust laws are really focused on the wrong issue. The antitrust laws talk about concentration of advertising in particular way they define the market. But what you really are concerned about is concentration of in the marketplace of ideas, television and print media now. The other areas are we really need to think more carefully about how the social media is capturing the value that is created by the legacy media. And that's where the bargaining code that Australia has pioneered has really made a difference, recognizing what's going on by the social media is stealing the value of the intellectual property being created by the legacy media and using their market power to allocate it. Now, it's going to be even worse with the advent of AI. New York Times suit here is really a defining moment. My time is up, but more broadly, there are a whole set of issues related to the recapture of the value that is created by our legacy media, and making sure that that in the absence of that, the rest of the social media depends on the production of good journalism, of investigative reports. And if they're stealing the value, there won't be the ability to provide. So you'll get social media circulating stories that have no really depth to them. So this is really an important issue for our society. So let me just say again, thank UNESCO and the National Press Club for hosting us, and hoping that we'll have a rich discussion of the importance of these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Stiglitz. Mr. Burgess, do you want to pick up and talk about what UNESCO's been doing?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to Professor Stiglitz and Anja Schäferin and Dylan Groves for compiling this study. I brought some copies all hot from the press from Paris, and they are lying here in the front, and I hope you can take them with you. It's also online, but some of us still like to read the paper and feel the smell of the ink. So copies are there. Thank you also to the National Press Club for organizing it, for Media for Development Foundation for helping us in setting it up, and to the World Bank of providing a speaker and contributing to this event in this way. So UNESCO is the UN lead agency on education, science, and culture, and most of people know about that and about its role in protecting natural and cultural heritage around the world. Not as many know that UNESCO is also the lead UN agency on information, on the free flow of information through text and image. And this is a very important part of UNESCO's work, and it leads to different things like advocating for press freedom, for freedom of expression, for the safety of journalists, and for access to information. Some years ago, we saw in the public discourse, not only in this country, but all over the world, that political leaders were attacking the press and journalism and denigrating its importance for society. And we saw even, it was also a reason for the UN system to interact, and for example, the Human Rights Council to actually state in a resolution to call on political leaders around the world to refrain from attacking the press, because it also created an environment where journalists were prey to attacks from a broader part of society. And we saw it in attacks during protest, for example. So when this came in connection with UNESCO's role as being protecting the free flow of information, based on certain resolutions. For example, 3 years ago, when Professor Stiglitz spoke at the UNESCO General Conference, all 193 member states of UNESCO approved the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration on Information as a Public Good. And this means that all 193 countries acknowledge that for democracy, for the development, journalism and media are an integral part. And this means also to provide the conditions, the economic and financial conditions, but also the social and political conditions for journalism and media to thrive. So when faced with all these troubles and the COVID-19 pandemic taking away resources from many of the world's media, how can we fight back? How can we support the fourth estate around the world? So we decided that it would be important for us to commission a study that would actually go through the literature and see if they could prove once and for all that the importance of journalism and for the media for democracy and for development was there. And that's why we are so happy to have this study by a distinguished author like Professor Stiglitz, Anja Schifrin, and Dylan Groves, that actually confirms this and provides recommendations on the way forward.
Thank you. And Dr. Gutierrez, so how does the World Bank support media and journalism, and why?
Well, I would like to think that Joe already made a case for economists actually being authorized to talk about this issue. And I'll pick it up first with about the title of this publication, which is Journalists for Development. And I guess this reflects the evolution of the way in which many of us have perceived development. In the many years ago, development was basically about growth, and which country grew faster than another one. Then we start recognizing that there were some of the aspects that were relevant, like income distribution, wealth distribution, and around the time that Joe was actually the chief economist at the bank, there was a major breakout when it was recognized that corruption was also not a political issue, but it was a development challenge. So the evolution about how we think development, it has many decades coming. And recently, we have been thinking also that issues that were very much in the periphery of what the World Bank used to do are relevant to development. Journalists, access to information are one of them, but also human rights, which many years ago were controversial, are part of it. And let me just mention a couple of things that we do, and then probably share a few of my concerns. So there are a few things that we are doing it very directly, right? I mean, we work with governments on implementing of the legislation to access to information, which is the equivalent of the Freedom Act, but also how to operate it and how to do it. We also work with governments in the implementation of open data systems so that actually citizens, journalists have access to information to the government. For a long time, we have also working directly with journalists in terms of, particularly in developing countries, in training them to understand budget information and financial information. Very often, the information that we economists produce is not necessarily in the easier way to understand it. But let me now share probably a couple of my concerns, and I may have more questions than answers on this one, because this is a very important paper, and I really enjoyed reading it. And borrowing, again, economist terminology, I think Joe and his co-authors were focusing on the supply side. How do we guarantee that we have a proper and free and independent, high-quality journalists? But we have been concerned more and more also on the demand side. So we checked some information before this meeting. And for example, in the US, for citizens between 18 and 29%, 32% get their news information from TikTok, right? If you open the Financial Times, just below the title of the article, you get the time that it's going to take you to read it. Because it's already assumed that the readers and audience are becoming lazy, and one way to entice them to read it is to make sure that it's not going to take too long. One other issue that we are concerned, it's, and this may be linked, I think, to an actual and deep-rooted economic problem. We are seeing a strong polarization across nations, not only in developing worlds, but in advanced economies too. My own sense is that the increase of inequality that we are seeing since the 80s is partially the root cause of that. But it has an implication also in terms of journalists. As societies are becoming widening apart, they have their preferred kind of news sources, right? And I would assume that people who watch Fox News probably is not the same people who read the New York Times or the New Yorker. And what is problematic about that is that even if the news are of quality, even if they are well presented and well written, there may be reluctance from part of the society to actually read those pieces if they do not align with their political views. But let me come back to your question and share quickly two other things which are along these lines in a slightly more indirect way, which we are doing at the World Bank and that we think is really important. There's one measure that our colleagues on the education department at the World Bank do, which is measuring if a 10-year kid is able to read properly a paragraph. And in sub-Saharan Africa, only 10% are able to read that. In Latin America, the numbers are better, but it's less than 50%. So that means that we are not preparing properly in the world the future readers and consumers of information. So we are working in two different kinds of these. One is this, the very basic thing. But we also have some projects a little bit more on middle-income economies in which working with the ministries of education, we are trying to help to have citizens which are not only educated in math, social science, etc., but also in critical thinking, that are able to bring and put together information from different from different sources. So these are some of the things that we are doing, but there's also some of the concerns that we are seeing.
Can either of you give us a concrete example of what happens to a country's economy when citizens lack access to accurate information?
Sure. I mean, let me actually, it's going to be strange to try to quote what Joe said and to explain what he said, but I guess he was alluding to a very specific, in the paper they are alluding to a very specific causality process, which is the lack of access to information have citizens that are less informed, and therefore governments either could engage in corrupt activities or be less efficient in terms of what they do. But Joe, probably you could explain better.
I mean, the example that I referred to of famines, where when governments know that there's a famine, they are forced to respond. If they don't know, there won't be a response. And that's maybe a dramatic example that has historically, by a march of sin, had a lot of influence in our thinking. But a lot of the things are you might say smaller corrupt governments that get exposed. One of the big events more recently where in your country, the Panama Papers exposed certain levels of corruption around the world, but in Iceland it led to a change of government. So that was a very dramatic. That's not a developing country, but it does show the power of the press and the role that it plays in accountability. And let me just say, the fact that there is a press looking at what you're doing affects people's behavior. So, hopefully, it's like, if you have the press there looking, maybe you won't discover any bad behavior because people know that will be detected. So the right, we know that if we aren't seeing it, people will behave badly, unfortunately. Not everybody. And we haven't, in the United States, had the extremes of attack on the press that we had, under Trump. But now it's there, and we now have to deal with that kind of a new environment that really undermines the ability of the press to do its job.
If I can just add on the Panama Papers story, because it's also a good example of what can be done in response to this, which is cross-country collaboration on investigative journalism. That these international consortium of investigative journalists, they can actually expose things that is very hard to do in a national story. So. So it's also a very interesting thing, because this consortium, they actually, from the economic side, they actually showed that there was that tax revenue was taken away from so many countries and from so many powerful players were hiding their funds outside their tax authorities, so they couldn't be invested into public goods. So that's also it's an interesting story, and in some countries this also had a political effect. But exposing corruption and identifying the flaws is the first step to solve the issues.
Yeah, let me just make one more comment, picking up on the importance of the international dimension, because within a country there are often lots of pressures that make it very difficult. And the one example that we all know about was the coverage of the weapons of mass destruction in 2003 as U.S. went to war in Iraq. You couldn't get good coverage in the United States. It was the Financial Times that was looking at this from abroad that said, you know, U.S., you're having hysteria. And American newspapers were a little bit nervous about being on the wrong side of a war. And it was the Financial Times that really said, well, you know, what's the evidence there? And you had the special reporter to Iraq said, has nobody north of, what was it, south of the Hudson looked at our report?
When you talked about the business model for news, and I've been in newspapers, I was in newspapers for 35 years now, I work for a Capitol Hill organization. Do people think they should have to pay for information? And if so, how did, because one of the things we encounter right now is people think it should be free. They get their news from their phone. They don't pay for something. So do you have to create in the public an attitude that it's something of value to you that you should pay for, or does it go through the government somehow and be subsidized?
That's a great question, and economists would begin by answering that with a slogan, there's no free lunch. And you don't get quality journalism, you don't do investigations for free. So somebody has to do it. So the fact that you're getting it for free over your iPhone doesn't mean it originated at a zero cost. So it has to be paid for. And that's why I've said that, you know, basically there are only two ways of doing it. Either it's going to be publicly paid for, and that's public support, or the producers of the information, the legacy media, you might say, get compensated. And the fact that you're reading it for free means that somebody ought to be paying. And the vehicle is the social media are making billions in terms of capital value, trillions off of this. They're making their money, I would put it very, by theft. They are stealing the intellectual property of the legacy media. And so one of the things that we are calling for, we don't use those strong words because we're, you know, trying to be moderate and reasonable, but it is theft. And what we're trying to call for is ways of recapturing that value by those who are producing that value, and that's what our intellectual property laws are about. There's a little debate, about whether they have been written in ways that cover. That's a lawyer's question. Mm-hmm. As a policymaker, the question is, should they be written in ways that allow for the capture of the value that's being created by the legacy media? And there, I think, there's no doubt about the right answer. The right answer for that is, yes, obviously, if they're creating this enormous value, those who are creating it ought to have the right to capture that.
If I can add just a couple of comments about that, because I think Joe is really nailing it on the head. The way in which digital companies are shifting the way in which we operate requires changing the regulation. We have a recent example 2 or 3 years ago when there was a major rehauling of the international taxation framework. And little by little, it started with this one, but everything is adjusting to a different way in which the markets operate. That on the one hand, but also from a distributional and I would say a fairness, economic fairness aspect is very important. We checked yesterday which were the top 10 companies in the New York Stock Exchange and by market capitalization. And the 6 largest are digital companies. And you have there Google, Microsoft, etc. So one of the reasons that companies could become really big in economic terms if they are collecting revenues without actually paying some of the costs. And this is what Joe is referring. I would like to add a comment to the first part of what you mentioned it, because it's particularly important for developing countries. The ability to have a publicly funded broadcast system, it's critical. And we have, interestingly enough, really robust experience across the globe, right? In the US, you have NPR, PBS, BBC. And it's not only that they are an example of what it could be done, but also they tend to have the same quality despite political cycles. And that's not what one should be expected, right? One could have expected if it's publicly funded, if the CEO of these companies is actually appointed by the president or the prime minister, they could be tailoring to the political interest, but it's not necessarily what we are seeing, at least so far. And what I think it's supporting this model of development is a very professional body and serious journalists and behind it.
Sorry, no. So one of the questions from the room here is, have you analyzed and compared news media in countries with a high number of free and independent journalists and high consumption against the United States media environment and where it stacks up?
In the studies we cited, I don't think there are that kind of cross-country comparisons, and partly because when you do that, there are so many other variables. What it does look at are, within a country, places where there are more media and there are less. India was one example, and there the results are unambiguous. But there is a little bit of the comparison. I mentioned Sweden as an example of a country where there's a trustworthy public media, and there have been studies that show that there's more trust in institutions and more trust in other media. So there's a real complementarity between these various forms of good media.
There is also we published at UNESCO a few months ago also another policy brief of this kind, co-written by Anja Schäfrin and others, on media viability in particular. And they come up with the analysis and some solutions. And they also identify that there are some countries, the Scandinavian countries, where they have managed to support local journalism through public means. And this also creates a more vibrant information system in general in that country. They also point to the issue already raised on social media and the digital platforms, where we have to acknowledge that they are a big part of the problem by taking away the advertising revenue from the legacy media. But they really need to understand that they need to be a part of the solution as well. So they cannot just lean back and be indifferent about the causes of this system that has been created.
Probably, if I may add, just because in the paper they quote several studies that has been done, some of them fairly recent. And while we still don't have these international comparisons, there's a new stream of economic literature devoted to this issue. So some of the key authors are mentioned there, Julia Caget in France. I think Joe was one. He won many relevant awards. Everybody knows about the economic Nobel Prize, but probably maybe almost as important as that was the John Bates Clark Award, which is given to an economist below 40 years old. And one of the recent people who got that award, Matthew Gensko, I hope I get the number correctly, is actually the starter of a new field of the economics of media. So from the research side, we are seeing an emerging interest on this aspect. So we may not see these international comparisons yet, but they are clearly underway.
I would also wonder, one of the ways that media that do function still is they derive their revenue off of page views, which a lot of them are generated by Google search. And when Google stops providing links to the articles and actually just starts writing the articles itself off of what it's scraped, or whatever search engine takes on the AI and does that, it's going to be an even more tumultuous change. And that's one of the questions here from the room is, what should society and journalists be thinking as these AI large language models are coming into play?
Well, I think there are two aspects that were brought out by the New York Times suit, which we didn't get into here. We wrote the report before that happened, and we would have, I think, maybe. But one of them is that you might say that the role of slander in AI, because they make up stories and say the New York Times said things which the New York Times hadn't said, and they were things that were wrong. And New York Times would have done a much better job of fact-checking and reference. So AI, at its current level of development, is giving false attribution, which is really a dangerous thing for our society, because it's creating a kind of mis and disinformation which could discredit the quality sources of journalism. So I think that there is whether the old laws on slander are appropriate or new laws have to be created, I think they have to be held accountable when they're attributing false statements to the media. So that's one problem that I think has not gotten as much attention, but it's very disturbing to me. But the second one is they're doing the scraping, and the way they work is essentially it's impossible to tell where they got their news from, or very difficult. There are some ways you can figure it out in certain pieces of what they call watermarking and that, but in general, it's very, very difficult to tell where they got the information. But the fact is that when you scrape, you're getting information from all kinds of sources. If there's any quality information in there, information doesn't go back to no free lunch. Information doesn't come free. Somebody had to have done it, and they've just taken that information. So either they're producing something of zero value, and then they ought to be dismissed. But if they're producing anything of value, they got that value from somebody, and they ought to be paying for that. And that's why I think I think the amount that New York Times is probably suing for is probably too low. But the market value of these companies is in the billions. All the value of it almost is attributable to the quality news that goes into it.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. Before I ask one more question, I want to thank the organizers of today's event, which are the co-team leaders of the Headliners team, Donna Lineland-Legere, Lori Russo, and Jen Judson, former president, whose name I should know how to pronounce. Also, a club member, Luis Manuel Botello, who is the president of the and CEO of the Media and Democracy Foundation, and our press club's program manager, Cecily Scott Martin, and the club's executive director, Didier Saudji. I'm also would like to let you know that there are some events coming up that you might be interested in. On April 25th, we're going to hear from White House Social Secretary Deisha Dyer, who's going to discuss her new memoir, Undiplomatic. And on May 1st, Wall Street Journal reporter and Pulitzer Prize finalist Dana Matoli will discuss her new book, The Everything War, Amazon's Ruthless Quest to Own the World and Remake Corporate Power. So wonder where she's going with that. And now it's also my honor to present, where are they? They're supposed to be there. They're right next. Oh, there they are. The official press club mug that people who do headliners get. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much as I step on things. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And let me just close with one other question that we had from the headliners team, that, you know, one characteristic of authoritarian government is that they suppress information. And if one of your solutions is that you really want the government to be putting more backing behind producing information, how do you prevent one from leading to the other? How do you prevent, if the government is now subsidizing information provided to citizens, how do you prevent that from being used by the government to get the results that they want from the public?
Yeah, well, that's really the point I refer to. You have creating institutional frameworks that prevent the politicization of that support. And you know, there are going to be countries that fail, but we know that some countries have succeeded. Sweden has succeeded, Norway, Scandinavian countries have succeeded. And we even know how to do it. And the United States has done it in many other areas. The National Science Foundation has really been, you know, you have a professional allocation of resources to different researchers. It's worked very well. You know, it's not been politicized. And at the same time, over time, it reflects societal concerns about what are the areas that we, as a society, care about, health or now AI. So it's worked very well. I believe we know the frameworks for creating independent institutions. Now, there are some societies where that fails. But the fact that it fails in some places is not a reason for us not to do it. The question is, can, say, the United States create those institutions? And I think before 2016, we all believed that we could. And I still believe that we can. And I think we can't really destroy our democracy because of fears of the fact that we've already destroyed it. We have to try to build our democracy. And part of building that democracy, it is going to necessitate creating these kinds of institutions for, as I say, a free, diverse, strong fourth estate.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to everybody who sent up questions. I'm sorry I can